Chapter 19. The truth is in the eye of the beholder. The fearsome voice tore through his room, while the claws cut through the thin linens, slicing them into ribbons. Silas lurched awake, grabbed for the staff, and thrust it out. "No, don't hurt my dad," he gasped. But nothing was there. His room was empty. The closet door was shut tight, and so was the window. On top of that, it was already morning. Bright sunlight crept through the drapes, slanting across the floor. But his heart still raced like he had been running a marathon, not like he'd been tucked into bed fast asleep. He could still remember the terrible, so diplomatic and polished yet so menacing voice. Then he heard something coming from the hall. He held the staff tighter and thrust it out for protection. Was the ghostly lion back? His heart beat rapidly, making him feel jittery. He strained his ears and listened, holding his breath. Then he heard it again. The soft thumping in the hall grew louder. Hop, thump, hop, thump. It was coming for him. A second later, a loud rap came from the door. Then it pushed open on its own, revealing a dark shadow with 4 legs standing in the hall. Silas raised the staff in defense. "No, stay away! Don't hurt me!" he yelled at the shadow. But it was just his father who stood in the doorway. The extra legs were only his crutches. He looked concerned, but also a bit amused by the dramatic display. Everything okay in here?" he asked, leaning on his crutches. He looked a bit haggard, as if woken from a deep slumber. His cast stretched all the way to his thigh, but now it looked colorful and fun with all the signatures and messages in multicolored ink. Silas realized that his father must have heard his screaming from his nightmare. He felt a bit sheepish. He lowered the staff slowly, feeling his cheeks flame in embarrassment. "Yeah, sorry. Just a bad dream." "Thought so, kiddo. If it makes you feel better, adults have them sometimes too." "Wait, you do?" Silas said in surprise. Contrary to making him feel better, the idea rattled him to his core. Adults like his father always acted so much braver than Silas felt on the inside. He had no idea that grown-ups could be scaredy cats and have terrible nightmares too. He had assumed that it was something you grew out of when you got older, like sugar cereal, skateboarding, or watching cartoon movies. The idea that this could be his fate for the rest of his life, well, stressed him out, of course. But what else was new? "How about this? I'll make you a deal," Dad said, spotting the apprehensive look on his face. "Next time you have a bad dream like that, come get me and wake me up, okay?" Even if you're asleep?" Silas asked. He hated bothering his parents. His dad needed rest to heal, and the baby barely let him or Mom get any shut-eye. And snoring and drooling? Especially then, Dad said with a chuckle. "That way we can face it together," he added as his expression softened. I'll always be here to protect you, even if I'm on crutches." He held them up and did a silly little dance, which, along with his reassuring words, melted away the fear and anxiety like some kind of fatherly magic spell. Silas felt better. "Thanks, Dad," he started. But then, "Wah! Wah! Wah!" The piercing cries cut through the house, rising and falling like the siren blaring from an ambulance. How could someone so tiny make so much noise? Silas chalked it up to one of the universe's great mysteries, along with what Stonehenge was really for. But it did reinforce his secret theory that, much like Stonehenge, his baby brother might be alien in origin. "Uh-oh, looks like we woke up the wambulance," Dad said with a grimace. He rubbed his temples. "I'd better go check on your mother and little brother." Silas laughed as his dad's cheesy joke. Almost nothing helped him shake his fears, except his dad. And bad jokes, he decided. Those were by far the best medicine. Dad turned around using his crutches, then shut the door and headed down the hall. The distinctive hop thump, could be heard even through the door. His footsteps grew softer. George kept bawling his head off, but then those cries grew quieter too. Dad had the magic touch. He could chase away frightening nightmares and soothe crying babies, like some kind of fatherly superhero. Only his jokes weren't nearly as good as Tony Stark's. In that department, Iron Man had him beat. Silas smiled at himself, then sank back into his bed. He wasn't afraid anymore, but he still felt exhausted, like he hadn't slept a wink, which was probably the case. The sheets were all twisted and tangled too. That nightmare probably had him thrashing around. Remnants of it shot back into his memory in flashes. First, it was the accented voice, which scared him as much as anything else. Then images of the dream with the ghostly lion springing out of his closet and attacking him, slashing at his neck. Silas shut his eyes, feeling terror rip through him, but then coaxed himself back from the edge. It wasn't real. It was just a bad dream. Next time, I'll get my father. But that brought back another memory. The ghostly lion had threatened his father's life. Silas felt guilty again, that terrible sensation. He was already responsible for his father's fall from the bridge, and his broken leg and fractured ribs. He couldn't stand to be responsible for any more injuries to him. Again, he reminded himself that none of that dream stuff was real. Plus, everything was getting better around the camp now. With the help of the townsfolk, they'd made tremendous progress on the repairs, and ever since Archie had given him the staff, it felt like the camp spirit was back. He felt cheered up by that thought, and the likelihood that the camp would reopen on schedule as planned. Still, sleepy, he reached for the sheets and untangled them, planning to snooze a bit more while the baby wasn't crying. But then his heart caught in his throat. The sheets were slashed to ribbons. He felt the fabric that had been torn through like a knife through soft butter. The slashes matched claws, and not just any claws, the ones from the ghostly lion in his nightmare. He poked his hand through the holes, remembering the razor-sharp claws stabbing at his neck. His breath caught, fear seizing hold of him. It squeezed at his heart and lungs, almost strangling him. He gasped for air as terrible thoughts crashed through his brain. If it was just a bad dream, then how could he explain the rips in his sheet? Did he somehow shred it while he was sleeping? Maybe he'd had a night terror? He'd read about those before, when you did crazy stuff in your sleep that you couldn't remember the next day, like sleepwalking or even eating. That had to be the explanation. Nothing else made any sense. But as he tried to rationalize it away, aided by the daylight burning through his window and chasing away the chill in the air, he felt deeply unsettled. What if the rumors were true? Initially, he believed the camp spirit was something brought to life by the staff. But now that he thought about it, the only thing the staff had brought about was releasing the ghostly lion. What if the lion was the camp spirit, not the staff? That would also explain why, even though Archie still carried the staff after his aunt died, the spirit had faded away, along with the campers. The staff wasn't enough. Had Aunt Scarlet truly realized the danger of the camp spirit and used the staff to lock it away in the chest? His eyes snapped to the closet, where the chest remained ensconced in the shadows. There were so many mysteries and strange occurrences, but none of them added logically. He thought about the accident on the bridge, his almost falling, then his dad's getting hurt. Not to mention the strange dreams and hauntings, and those creepy, giggling hyenas the night before that had stalked him from the shadows all the way home. He shuddered, sinking down into his bed under the ripped sheets. They provided flimsy protection. He reached for the staff, feeling the cool, polished wood. Confusion roiled through him. like an echo from the bad dream. There was only one thing he knew for sure. It's almost like someone or something doesn't want my family here, he whispered to himself, feeling a deep chill despite the bright sunlight that promised another sweltering day. Hyenas? Here at Camp Pride Rock? Archie stabbed at a sausage and took a bite, then flashed Silas a confused look. Around them, the rest of their little crew had gathered in the mess hall for breakfast. The twins, his parents and brother, and Sarah, bustling around in the kitchen, finishing up. I could have sworn I heard them last night, Silas said, on my way back to the cabin. Hyenas. In Arizona, Archie repeated, as though expecting a joke. Silas felt his cheeks turn hot. He looked down at his plate. Yeah, he choked out, feeling like mentioning it had been a bad idea. You sure it wasn't them coyotes? Archie said, dipping his sausage in syrup and forking it into his mouth. Howling at the moon? They love to do that round this time. I know what they sound like, but this was different. They were giggling. Huh, that sounds like hyenas, all right. But none of them live around these parts. Not unless they're in a zoo, Archie said with a snort, but then he softened. Sorry to disappoint you. He glanced at the nature books that Silas had toted to breakfast, open to the section on hyenas. Right, I knew that, Silas said, but you said my aunt rescued some? Well, it's a long shot, but maybe some of them escaped and still live out here in the Pride Lands? Archie thought that over. We had some in the enclosures, but they were sent away long ago. They were too much trouble. Doubt they'd even still be alive. Trouble? Silas asked. Mischievous little devils, Silas said. They'd creep into our other enclosures and, well, prey on some of the other animals. We decided that we couldn't keep them around. You mean they killed the other animals? Archie nodded. Chickens were their favorite. We used to raise our own so we could use the eggs, but the hyenas were a handful. The biggest problem? They're too smart for their own good. When they look at you, it's like there's an intelligence there. Reminds me of the lions. He gestured to the old camp pictures framed along the walls. Some displayed groups of campers crowded around his aunt. In the pictures were zebras, elephants, an ostrich, a small pride of lions, and even some gophers, standing alert with their heads popped up to survey landscape. And then he spotted them. In one picture of a younger-looking Archie, the scavengers looked in a pen with their bristled, spiky fur and sharp teeth and sharper eyes. How long have you worked here? Silas asked, studying the picture. Archie furrowed his brow. Well, I've been here since the start. I was your aunt's first hire, back when she first came up with the idea of a camp that was also an animal sanctuary. Oh, wow. I didn't know that. He hadn't realized the groundskeeper was that old. But it made sense. His aunt had also been older than his father, who was the baby of their family by many years. Yep, I'm about as old as the camp, Archie said, with a self-deprecating laugh, and probably just as run down. But like the camp, I'm still hanging in there, I suppose. Silas giggled at that thought. Ha, you're too kind to this old bag of bones, Archie went on. Sometimes Scarlett used to say that I've been here so long I should inherit the camp one day. Really? What changed your mind? Archie smiled. Actually, you did. What do you mean? Silas asked in surprise. Scarlett never had kids, as you know, though she often thought of the campers and rescue animals as her legacy, so to speak. She cared about them, all, big and small, as if they were her own. Silas felt sad. I wish I could have known her better. She sounds so amazing. Archie nodded. That she was. And more. Anyway, she planned to leave the camp to me, but then you came along, little prince. Your dad called her up one day saying that you wanted to be a camper. Turns out you loved all the same books as your aunt. Like Tarzan? Silas asked. Archie nodded. Guess so. I'm not much of a reader myself. Anyway, somewhere along the way, Scarlet changed her mind and decided the camp should stay in the family so it would one day belong to me, Silas said in awe. Archie nodded and patted Silas's head fondly. But I assure you, there are no hyenas lurking around our campgrounds, let alone anywhere in Arizona. Silas closed the book with the section on the hyenas, feeling silly. But something had been following him the night before. He was sure of it. He remembered that strange laughter. Archie spotted the look on his face. I reckon you've got just as active as an imagination as your aunt. That's not a bad thing. Out of imagination come great creations. I can see why your aunt fancied you so much and wanted you to eventually inherit the camp. That cheered Silas up. He appreciated the groundskeeper's kind words. Maybe his overactive imagination explained the other strange things that he'd been seeing too. He felt better that his aunt shared the same gift, even if it felt more like a curse, he thought grimly. Look, don't worry about the coyotes, or whatever they were. Archie went on in a kindly voice. He tapped the walking stick. Remember, the staff protects you. With that, Archie polished off the last sausage, grabbed his cowboy hat, and headed off to work. His parents headed back to the cabin with George, who was growing fussier by the minute, while Sarah called the twins back to do their extra tutoring. Apparently, Timothy struggled with math during the year, and, well, Natasha enjoyed math. Ugh, math, Timothy groused, looking mopey as he cleared his plate. Yep, fractions today, Natasha said, sounding freakishly cheerful. My favorite. Fractions today. Sazu called from his perch in the rafters of the mess hall. Really? You're nuts. Who likes fractions? Timothy shot back. How are we even related? Huh, and twins no less, Natasha said. The hospital must have made a mistake, Timothy said. It can totally happen. I saw it in a movie once. They switched one of us at birth. No chance we share DNA. You wish, Natasha said. You're stuck with me and my love of fractions. Forever. She wiggled her fingers and made spooky, haunting noises. Ugh, math geek. Get away, Timothy cried, dodging her ticklish fingers. But she got to his sensitive spots under his arms, making him squirm and writhe with laughter. The little repartee made Silas giggle. It was true. You could be siblings, even twins, but also so different. He thought of his little brother. What would George be like when he got older? Would they have anything in common? Silas hoped that they would, and that his annoying way-ambulance phase, as his father had called it this morning, wouldn't last forever, but he feared that they'd grow up to be total opposites with absolutely nothing in common. As the twins got up to do their math, he realized that even if you were different, you could still have a deep bond, even stronger than a friendship, like a siblingship, perhaps. He'd like that idea. But then he cringed. Did this mean George was actually growing on him? Like a fungus, he muttered under his breath. See you after school, Timothy said, having recovered from the vicious tickle attack. Yep, after I torture him with fractions, Natasha said with a wink. Come on, Sazu. Torture. Fractions. On command, the parrot flapped down from the rafters and alighted on her shoulder. The bird was trained and super smart. Silas was impressed. The twins tramped through the back door, still arguing about fractions, leaving Silas alone. Tricky math would likely soon be his fate too. Luckily, his parents had granted him the summer off from any kind of studying to adjust to his new life. Instead, he pulled out his favorite book, Tarzan of the Apes. The title was printed across the cover, over the thrilling illustration of Tarzan trying to rescue Jane from a ferocious creature. His heart beat faster in anticipation of the adventure story. He flipped open his dog-eared copy, which he had lovingly read and reread and then reread again. Somehow, the magic of this book never got old, even though he'd memorized most of it. But then, he heard something strange. It was soft, barely audible, but it sounded like a drumbeat. Thump, thump. It came again, louder this time, reverberating through the empty mess hall, and it definitely sounded like drums. He looked up from his book, where he'd already sped through the first chapter, barreling on to the next, totally hooked. How did the book do that? But the mess hall was eerily quiet except for the steady whir of the ceiling fans cooling it down. He strained his ears but heard nothing strange. With a sigh, overactive imagination, he went back to his reading. But then it came again. Thump, thump. This time it was even louder than before. He jerked his head up, and it abruptly stopped. But then he zeroed in on something on the wall. An old black and white photograph of a group of campers holding rustic drums. They were pounding on them with sticks. Feeling unsettled, he set the book down, careful to fold down his page, though he knew that was slowly destroying his beloved book. He approached the picture, his feet padding over the wooden floorboards, kicking up dust as he went. No matter how much Sarah swept, the sand and dust found their way inside, pooling in the cracks and nooks in the floor and settling into the corners. He reached the picture and studied the campers' young faces. They looked so joyful to be playing their silent rhythm on those drums. His aunt stood over them, clutching her staff, with Zazu perched on it. She wore a proud expression. He started down the lines of pictures. This was the first time he'd inspected them up close. But then he heard it again. Thump, thump. He snapped his gaze back to the drum's circle picture. The campers' hands in the picture moved up and down as they pounded on the drums. What the? Silas started. The campers froze. It looked like an ordinary photograph once more. He hurried back to the picture, but nothing was out of place. Was this his imagination again? Or something else? He couldn't be sure what he saw. A trick of light and shadow? The exciting book revving up his imagination, which tended to run wild? He shook his head, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that gripped him like the morning after a bad dream, when all you remembered were fragments and feelings and the fright. But now the pictures had his attention. He went down the row, taking in this rich history of the camp, laid out in stark black and white photography, the kind of pictures that you had to have developed and printed. His father had explained it to him once while showing him the family picture album with the camp photos. Each picture showcased a delightful memory: kids chowing down in the mess hall, which was bursting at capacity, the animal sanctuary in full swing, with the enclosures filled with rescue animals, marshmallows roasting over the campfire, a group of hikers tramping over the rope bridge, which looked sturdy and didn't have missing boards. He could feel the camp spirit clearly as he took in these pictures, clutching at the staff, which he now found himself carrying everywhere he went, just like his aunt had done. He stopped on the last picture of her. She stood alone in this pose, posed under the Camp Pride Rock sign. She held the staff with Zazu in it. Her expression looked hopeful and proud as she wielded a pair of scissors to cut through a ribbon tied across the entrance to the camp. The brass placard posted under the photograph read, "Opening Day, Camp Pride Rock." As he took in her youthful face, Silas thought about what Archie said earlier, how his aunt wanted him to inherit the camp one day. He didn't feel worthy, but as he gazed upon this picture, he felt a connection to her stronger than he'd ever felt, a kinship of sorts, though he never knew her well. They loved the exact same books, and both had active imaginations. Suddenly, the staff zapped him. He felt the jolt travel up the wood, like an electric current, and then through his body. He looked at it with a start, and then something else happened. The picture of his aunt came alive. At first, it was like watching a movie. His aunt cut the ribbon, and then cheered for the grand opening of the camp. But then, her face contorted in pain, then started to shrivel up with her eyes popping out of her head as she began to look like a corpse. No, This can't be real, Silas gasped, backing away in horror. But he couldn't avert his gaze. She continued shriveling up as pieces of flesh went missing from her face, like she was being mauled by a wild animal. It was appalling. Silas stared, frozen with fear, worse than when he watched spooky movies with Jose. His aunt lunged at Silas through the picture frame. Her skeletal hands grabbed at his shirt. Then her mouth moved, though it was only jawbones and protruding teeth. Her voice sounded raspy, but it rang through the mess hall loud and clear. Who did this to me? Help me!